Okay, welcome to PSYCU101. As we discussed, since the concurrent students had their spring break this week, we're going to do a couple of chapters online. And I told you this past Thursday when you had your test where the link is for this particular class. Obviously, if you're here, you're going to watch the class. And it's going to be a bit different. It's not my favorite sort of mode of operation. As you know, I like the interaction between us, but obviously this is one way. So basically, I'm just going to sort of cut to the chase. And as I say in class sometimes, for test purposes, essentially all of this is going to be for test purposes. Because we don't have the interaction, because we don't have the research findings. Obviously, I'm going to cover a lot more ground in a shorter period of time. The benefit is that if I do get a little bit ahead of you, unlike in class where I encourage you to let me know if we need to go back and look at something, then obviously you can go back and take a look at the video again. So, without any further ado, let's jump into Chapter 10 on motivation and emotion. And we're going to spend more time with motivation. It's not that emotion is a less important topic. Both very, very important topics in psychology. But the text spends a bit more time with motivation and emotion, and we'll sort of follow suit. As we always do, let's go through the vocabulary. So I hope that you have your textbook there with you so that I can refer to the page number as I do in class, and you can take a look at where the definitions are for these particular terms. Now, the first definition obviously is related to the topic of this chapter, and it's motivation. And you can see on page 321 that motivation is defined as an internal processes that initiate, sustain, and direct activities. Motivation is not something that you can see. You can't look at somebody and say, well, there's their motivation. But we all know motivation exists. It's a concept. Remember earlier we talked about a concept, something that identifies something or categorizes something that has a lot of sort of similar features or characteristics. Well, there is some energy that we refer to as motivation that has these characteristics, being able to initiate, sustain, and direct activities. And that conceptually we refer to as motivation. So the definition for test purposes is on page 321. Now, there are a lot of ways to look at motivation, but the simplest way to look at motivation is in terms of a drive. And you can see also on page 321 that a drive is defined by the psychological expression of internal needs or value goals. For example, hunger, thirst, and the drive for success. Now, usually when we think of a drive, we think more in terms of the biological drives. Here, the definition includes some sort of psychological aspects of the term drive. But the simplest way to look at motivation is in terms of the biological processes that constitute a drive. Obviously, I mean, I'm not telling you something that you don't know. That if you get hungry, you are motivated to get food. If you get thirsty, you're motivated to get something to drink. So this is the simplest and easiest understandable form of motivation. And I didn't throw in the term need, but you can see that term right above the term homeostasis. So when we have a need, a biological need, we are driven to satisfy that need, and that's what we refer to as a drive. Now, the term homeostasis, we've talked about this before. When we were looking at the nervous system, this was a very important term in terms of our understanding of the nervous system. And homeostasis, as you see here again, and it was defined for us before, a steady state of bodily equilibrium. We applied it specifically to the nervous system before, but now we're applying this term more globally. That we attempt, the body attempts, our bodies attempt to maintain a balance, and that is what we refer to as homeostasis. Whenever we get out of balance, whenever this balance is tipped in any way, then that is when a need develops, and that's when there is the potential for motivation. And motivation is this attempt to restore this homeostasis, this balance that the body tries to maintain. Now, one of the things that affects this homeostasis, and all of us experienced this recently with the time change to daylight savings time and spring and forward, the term circadian rhythm. I'd like for you to be familiar with this, and some of you probably already are. But the term is defined on page 323, and you can see that circadian rhythms are defined as the cyclical changes in bodily functions and arousal levels that vary on a schedule of approximately 24 hours a day. Now, the most obvious, circadian rhythm is the sleep-wake cycle. We sleep a certain period of time, then we're awake a certain period of time, and this is somewhat cyclical. But there are other circadian rhythms. Our temperature is not the same. Our body temperature is not the same throughout the 24-hour period. So there are fluctuations, and this is what we refer to as the circadian rhythm. So again, for test purposes, these cyclical changes in body functions and arousal levels that vary on a schedule of approximately 24 hours a day. You can find this on page 323. Now, obviously, these cyclical changes affect our motivation. Think in terms of what happened when we moved from standard time to daylight savings time. Your body had established a homeostatic balance for that prior, that standard time circadian rhythm. When we went to daylight savings time, then your body had to make a shift. That homeostatic balance was changed, was upset, and so you had to adjust. And so you were motivated, to adjust to that new circadian rhythm. I'll leave out hypothalamus. This is a very important part of our bodily functions that affect hunger and other types of processes that lead to motivation. But for test purposes, just leave that out. On page 329, a term that I'm sure all of you have heard, and most of you know exactly what it is: anorexia nervosa. And you can see that it is active self-starvation or a sustained loss of appetite that has psychological origins. Very unfortunate condition, as we know that it primarily affects teenage girls who have a distorted body image. They think that they are fat when in reality they've got themselves too thin. It starts out as a psychological condition, so there's a sort of upset of the psychological homeostasis in terms of first developing a distorted body image. Unfortunately, this very quickly leads to biological changes that can be life-threatening. So a person sort of upsets their homeostatic balance in terms of electrolytes, in terms of protein, in terms of carbohydrates, to the point where it physically threatens their existence. Again, some of you may know this condition very well because hopefully you haven't experienced it, although this semester in research findings, I don't think in this class, as I recall, but in one of my classes, a person made a very good presentation on anorexia nervosa because they had experienced the condition. And I'm sure that some of you know someone who either had full-blown anorexia nervosa or the symptoms of anorexia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa, defined on page 331. This is excessive eating, usually followed by self-induced vomiting and or taking laxatives. We know that this is a condition that affects primarily women in their 20s, sometimes in their 30s. Once again, women who are concerned about their weight. But unlike anorexia nervosa, which is active self-starvation, as some of you already know with bulimia, the person actually eats too much, but then feels guilty about how much they ate, and then attempts to purge themselves of what they ate. And this is why we call it the binge purge syndrome. They purge, they binge, and then after they binge, they feel guilty or they feel awful about having binged, and then they attempt to purge. Now the danger is that the purging rids the body of essential nutrients. Also, there's some things occur in the digestive tract with vomiting and laxatives and so on and so forth. But the real life-threatening thing here is that the person can deplete their electrolytes, and electrolytes are related to that process that we looked at when we looked at the nervous system in terms of the sodium and potassium. Remember how that interacted to allow that electrical message to be generated in the nervous system that flows from neuron to neuron. If that process is disrupted, obviously it can lead to changes that are not adaptive, and eventually can be life-threatening. So there's some real dangers with bulimia nervosa. It's a bit different because you look at a person who's bulimic, and many times you say, well, this person, there's nothing wrong with this person. This person looks, healthy. But the problem is this binge purge, and it can upset the homeostatic balance. And specifically, as we talked about before, in the nervous system, it can upset that process where the action potential cannot be generated in the neuron, and so therefore it disrupts those processes that are activated by those action potentials that are generated in the neurons. Leave out sex drive. I think we all know what that is. Need for achievement, leave that out for test purposes. But I would like to mention the terms intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation on page 339. You can see that intrinsic motivation is defined as motivation that comes from within rather than from external rewards, motivation based on personal enjoyment of a task or activity. Let me go ahead and sort of go over the definition of extrinsic motivation on page 339, and then I'll contrast the two. Extrinsic motivation, as you can see, is motivation based on an obvious external rewards, obligations, or similar factors. So intrinsic motivation is when we are motivated, and obviously we talked about this before, that motivation is what sort of initiates behavior, gets us going. So intrinsic motivation, we sort of get ourselves going from internal forces. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, there are external factors. For instance, with extrinsic motivation in class, if you study to make a good grade, simply to make a good grade, the grade is an external factor, so that's extrinsic motivation. Whereas a person who reads a book simply because they're motivated, they're self-motivated to get more knowledge, that would be referred to as intrinsic motivation. Now, some of you may end up being teachers, and one of the things that teachers love is to see students have intrinsic motivation. It would be a wonderful world if we didn't have to give tests. I know that you would think that would be a wonderful world too.